What if everything you thought you knew about Noah's Ark was wrong? For centuries, we've been taught to see this story as a spectacle of divine fury and total annihilation. But beneath that headline is a more subtle, more human tale, one about warning, about the limits of systems that fail, and about how communities imagine starting over. Today, we'll take a calm, curious look at the message ancient authors wanted to leave behind. This story appears everywhere: the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, flood accounts in Hindu Puranas, Greek tales, and indigenous stories across the Americas and the Pacific. These similarities aren't accidental. They point to a common human experience, facing overwhelming change and needing a language to understand it. Rather than a literal global meteorological event report, these narratives function like moral and social maps. They explain why societies collapse, how survivors rebuild meaning, and what values are essential for life to continue. Over the next 10 minutes, we'll ask 3 guiding questions. Why did ancient people write flood stories in the first place? What did the Ark stand for to them? A literal ship, yes, but also a symbol with layers of meaning. And finally, how can a story written thousands of years ago speak to our modern crises? Environmental collapse, social breakdown, the sense of collective anxiety. We'll be careful with the sources, patient with paradox, and generous with the idea that myths were never meant only to frighten. They're meant to teach, to warn, and to offer a path toward renewal. Visually, imagine a single animation style throughout: clean, expressive lines, soft color palettes, and symbolic transitions that move from storm to quiet earth. The people and animals keep the same appearance as we move through time. Continuity matters here, because this is a story passed from generation to generation. So let's step into that arc of story and see what it carries beyond the familiar headline of destruction. When we study flood stories as ancient wisdom literature, a different logic emerges. These narratives often arise from communities that have experienced ecological stress, political collapse, or cultural disintegration. They are not written as weather reports. They are moral and social diagnoses. In the ancient Near East, authors crafted flood accounts to explain how and why a society might need a radical reset, to clear corruption, realign values, and make way for renewed order. Consider the kinds of pressures ancient peoples faced: prolonged droughts that ruined harvests, river courses that shifted, invading armies that destroyed cities, or epidemics that emptied towns. Such disasters create a narrative vacuum. Why did this happen, and how do we live on? Flood myths answer those questions by personifying disorder as a deluge that must wash away what went wrong. The flood becomes an existential metaphor, a cleansing that removes more than just physical debris. It removes moral rot, failed leadership, and broken social contracts. These stories also belong to a literary genre that teaches through compact, memorable images. In wisdom traditions, teaching often works through emblematic events: a flood, a fire, a journey, that crystallize complex ideas. Flood narratives teach lessons about responsibility, humility, communal ties, and the fragile balance between human systems and nature. They tell listeners, pay attention to how you organize your society. Neglect the weak and you risk systemic collapse. Live in hubris and you'll invite catastrophe. So when ancient authors described a cosmic deluge, they were addressing practical concerns: how to rebuild a city, how to redistribute resources after displacement, how to reestablish kinship and trade. The flood story becomes a cultural tool for reimagining life after breakdown. It models both the cost of failure and the work of reconstruction, not by promising a miraculous, effortless fix, but by setting before listeners the hard work of renewal: planting, reweaving social bonds, creating just laws. Now let's look closely at the Ark and why it matters so deeply. In Hebrew, the word is teva, an unusual term that surfaces only twice: Noah's Ark and the basket that carries baby Moses. Both are floating sanctuaries, both shelters that preserve life amid danger. This linguistic link subtly frames the ark as a vessel of deliverance, not merely survival. The ark's geometry in Genesis, long, wide, and tall in proportion, reads like an architectural statement. Its rectangular shape suggests stability, an ordered refuge floating on chaotic waters. Importantly, the ark has no sail or rudder. It does not steer so much as endure. That detail shifts the emphasis from human mastery to preservation. What matters is safeguarding life, not controlling the flood. The ark embodies a humble approach to crisis. Build what you can, protect what you value, and trust that the world will reorder itself when the waters fall. Another profound layer is inclusivity. The text insists on pairs of animals, representatives of every kind. This is not a selective rescue of the elite. It's a radical preservation of biodiversity and social continuity. The ark protects domestic animals and wild ones, predators and prey, symbolizing a commitment to maintaining the full web of life. For ancient audiences, that would signal an ethic. Renewal must be communal and comprehensive, not merely a reprieve for favored classes. The ark also preserves relationships. 2x2 evokes pairings, partnership, family, and the continuation of lineage. It preserves the biological and social ties that make societies resilient. Mating pairs, livestock that sustain survivors, animals that symbolize cultural identity. In this sense, the ark is a microcosm, a floating community that models cooperation, resource sharing, and interdependence under pressure. Finally, consider the ark as a covenant space. It is both shelter and a sacred container where a new social contract can form. On board, the survivors are not only saved, they are charged with the task of rebuilding differently. The ark's interior life, the sounds of animals, the routines of caregiving, the discipline of sharing, suggests how new societies are imagined: attentive, inclusive, and oriented toward stewardship rather than domination. When the waters finally recede, the story turns from endurance to creative labor. Noah's first acts after disembarking are revealing. He builds an altar, offers sacrifice, and then plants a vineyard. These are not random rituals. They mark acts of consecration and cultivation. Planting signals a forward-looking faith, an investment in future seasons, in food, in music and ceremony that sustain culture. It's a bottom-up reconstruction: soil, seed, community. Noah's role shifts from passive survivor to active co-creator. He doesn't simply inherit a restored world, he helps to remake it. That partnership with the divine is a key theological and existential point. Renewal in the story requires human participation: work, repentance, attentiveness to relationships and land. The narrative suggests that divine mercy sets the conditions, but human effort actually rebuilds the world. The rainbow that concludes the story functions as a public promise, an enduring sign that destruction will not be the default mode of the universe. Scientifically, a rainbow appears when light refracts in water droplets, a meeting of sun and rain, order and chaos producing beauty. Symbolically, it announces a covenant. Cycles continue, but they will not culminate in irretrievable annihilation. Instead, there will be limits, reminders, and a renewed commitment to life. Psychologically, the story models recovery from trauma. After collective catastrophe, communities need rituals, narratives, and institutions that prevent repetition. The flood story gives a structure for mourning loss, learning moral lessons, and setting new boundaries. It teaches that hope is not naive optimism, it's disciplined resilience, planting the vineyard, sharing food, and making vows that guide future behavior. So what does this ancient tale offer us now? We live with multiple overlapping crises: climate change and rising seas, political polarization, economic disruption, and the disorienting speed of technological change. At times, it can feel like we are navigating our own floods. The Noah narrative reframes such moments, not as final apocalypse, but as calls to restart thoughtfully. That reframing comes with practical implications. First, renewal demands inclusion. If recovery efforts favor only the powerful, the old problems return. The Ark's emphasis on all kinds of life models a politics of breadth: care for vulnerable populations, for biodiversity, for cultural diversity. Second, renewal requires ritualized attention, ceremonies, public commitments, policies that encode new values. Planting a vineyard is like investing in sustainable agriculture. Building an altar is like codifying protections for the commons. Third, the story invites humility. The Ark lacks a rudder. It preserves rather than dominates. Today, that translates into stewardship, designing systems that adapt to change rather than falsely promising total control. Finally, the covenant idea offers hope without complacency. We can make promises to one another and hold institutions accountable so that destructive cycles are less likely to repeat. As this calm exploration closes, take away this: Noah's story is not a celebration of ruin, but an instruction manual for beginning again. Its power lies in showing that destruction can catalyze care, that shelter can teach stewardship, and that after every deluge, there is ground ready for planting. If you liked this perspective, imagine it animated in a single, continuous visual style. The same characters, the same continuity, moving from storm to new growth. In those images, the ancient story becomes a modern guide. How to preserve what matters, rebuild what broke, and look for the rainbow that promises a future worth tending.